Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down a severe weather event that'll be taking place across parts of the United States, including the Midwest, over the next few days, bringing the risk for damaging winds, massive hail, and a few tornadoes. We'll also be discussing the massive heat dome in the United States that'll bring record-breaking temperatures to parts of the country. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. We'll first begin with the central and as well as the northern plains. You'll notice there is some shower and storm activity out there currently. Most of it's weak, not really a whole lot of severe weather out there today, but there will be an increased risk of severe weather as we go into the afternoon and evening, both for the central and northern plains and as well as parts of the Midwest. I'll be talking about more on that in a moment. Now, further off into the Midwest, we do have some cloud activity up there. There's some showers ongoing, maybe a couple of storms. This is the prerequisite to what we're actually going to see later today in terms of a risk for severe weather, with all modes of severe weather being possible. Again, I'll discuss more on that in a moment. Back over on the East Coast, we still have some showers ongoing in New England. Back up in the Northeast, it has been cloud cover almost non-stop for the past couple weeks. There will be a break from that, though, as we go into the later weekend as well as into the weekend, as that low pressure system finally moves off to the north and east. And then back down in the southern plains, we have a heat dome. You can actually notice the little ring here of the clouds. This area here is right now in a heat dome where we're basically seeing record-breaking high temperatures, especially today. Some areas in Texas could get as high as 115 to 120 degrees. So it's a very hot day coming up there, and it will also be fairly humid in some areas, which will just make that heat even worse. Now let's talk a little bit more about the pattern that we're in currently in the United States and what this will do over the next several days. We'll begin with what's happening right now. Again, we have that heat dome back down in the southern plains. That's going to sit there for a little while, bringing really excessive heat and as well as a lot of humidity with a strong southerly pole. And then back over here to the west, we have a trough that's sitting back over on the west coast. This could increase the risk for severe weather over the next few days. And then back over on the east coast, we have a much weaker trough that is ongoing back over into the northeast. Now, as we go out throughout the later week and as well as into the weekend, you'll notice that little trough ejection back over in the Rocky Mountains from that westerly trough. This will start to move off to the east, and this will actually increase the risk for severe weather as we get closer to Friday and Saturday across areas like the Central Plains and perhaps the Midwest and Ohio Valley. So something to watch for here very closely. That big dome of heat still continues down in the South United States, but there will be some relief with that trough ejection. It will actually be just far enough to the south where we might see some shower and storm activity across areas like Texas, maybe Oklahoma and Arkansas. That'll definitely help some heat relief as we go into Saturday. And once we go into next week, things become fairly quiet in the United States. We're not really looking at any trough ejections or really any organized jet stream across the United States. So pretty interesting change there. Now for the temperatures, it's going to be very hot. Record-breaking temperatures really likely across areas in the southern and central plains. And then as we go later into the week, we'll see that heat start to move a bit more off to the east. You'll notice above average temperatures across the eastern half of the United States. As that trough shifts offshore from the east coast, that'll eventually allow for more heat to be able to enter that region, and as well as a lot more humidity across a large chunk of the Ohio Valley. And then once we go into the weekend, that little trough ejection might bring some cool air to some areas, but it's not going to be much. Now for areas in the southern and central plains, a few degrees is a lot of relief, so there will be some relief there, but overall it's not going to be a major cool down by any means. No Arctic blast or anything like that. And then once we go into next week, there might be some cool air during the tail end of the week in the northern plains, but again, a little bit more uncertainty remains as we go into the long term. Now let's talk about that severe weather potential for today. We'll begin with the Midwest, where there is a slight risk of severe weather with a pretty large marginal risk outside of that. That does mean there's at least a low end threat for some severe weather today, including all modes of severe weather. I'll talk about more on that in a moment. And back over in the central plains, which we will not talk about a whole lot, but there is a slight risk there, mostly for the threat of large to very large hail, damaging winds, and perhaps maybe an isolated tornado. But it's a pretty large area overall. Even though it's a low end threat, we could see isolated severe weather, or maybe widely scattered across a very large area from the Midwest all the way back through the central and northern plains. Now for those in the Midwest, the main concern for today is damaging winds and large hail. It's going to be a fairly low end threat, though. When I say that, I'm talking about maybe up to about 2-inch diameter hail and maybe damaging winds up to 70 miles per hour. We're not going crazy like yesterday where we saw 115 mile per hour wind gusts back down in areas like northern Oklahoma near Turpin. I mean, we saw 114 mile per hour wind gusts last night. We're not going to see something like that today. Large hail potential primarily going to be focused across, again, anywhere in the Midwest, but it's going to be an isolated risk. Tornado risk is very low today. There's not really going to be a whole lot to be able to create any sort of tornadic activity. There might be an isolated brief tornado, but the threat today is very low overall. Tomorrow will be a different story, which we'll talk about more on that in just a second. Now for the timing of these storms, we're going to going to begin to see showers and storms fire up around Minneapolis around 3 to 4 o'clock this afternoon. These will be mainly damaging wind and large hail producers, but again, this is the area that we just have enough shear for maybe perhaps a brief tornado and maybe a little bit more organization, because these will be a little bit more discreet in nature. Once we get closer around 7 or 8 o'clock, you'll notice the storms back up in Wisconsin. They'll be ongoing, but look down in areas like Illinois as well as Iowa and northeast Missouri, which are under risk of severe weather. There's nothing at all on the future radar, but that is a bit of a misprint here, because we're going to see storms actually fire up later in the evening. So closer to midnight or so, that's when storms will fire up down there. We'll continue to see showers and storms across central Wisconsin. Eventually going into the overnight hours, storms will continue. A lot of these will produce some mode of at least strong weather in terms of maybe gusty winds or small hail, but there also could be a couple of severe storms in there with some large hail and damaging winds. So make sure you take those proper precautions tonight, and then by tomorrow morning we'll have a full-blown cluster of storms back down in areas like Indiana. Now, in my opinion, tomorrow is going to be the most concerning day of severe weather for at least the next several days. We currently have a slight risk of severe weather across parts of the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. One key note, though, is that this could go to an enhanced risk. It's not out of the question. We're going to be watching, though, for the threat of damaging winds. That's going to be one of the biggest concerns, especially across areas like Illinois, Indiana, northern Kentucky, as well as northeast Missouri, southeast parts of Iowa. That's where the greatest damaging wind potential is. We could still see some isolated damaging winds outside of that, but notice this large to very large hail potential. We do have a hatched area. This is where lapse rates will be the steepest. This will increase the risk for some large to very large hail. So definitely make sure you're staying weather aware, take the proper precautions before these storms do end up firing up tomorrow, because we could see some massive hail upwards of 3 inches in diameter. Tornado risk as well is a little bit increased from what we usually see. It's going to be about a 5% probability back through parts of Illinois. This is definitely a bit more concerning. We could see this actually increase a little bit more as well, just in terms of a larger scale. I don't know if we'll go up to a 10% probability, but at least for right now, we're at a 5%. And that's overall, again, going to be the potential for at least a few tornadoes are possible. So make sure, again, you have a tornado action plan in place just in case for tomorrow. Now, storm action will start to fire up during the afternoon. We're going to see some pretty significant storms and really nasty storms fire off quite quickly across areas in Wisconsin as well as into northern Illinois. These will really produce large hail initially with the threat of a tornado and as well as damaging winds. And eventually going through the evening hours, storms continue to move off to the east, and we might see another cluster going to the late overnight hours. So that is definitely going to be a concern as well. But one thing that we do need to keep in mind here on this future radar is that it does not indicate storms firing up across like areas like Illinois. Now, that is because we could see storms fire here. It's going to be a little bit more of a conditional risk. So keep that in mind. Even though there is that slight risk of severe weather, there is again a chance for some severe storms. It's just a hit or miss, basically. It's maybe like a 50-50 chance right now. But otherwise, again, we're watching for some significant cells either way. They're going to fire off potentially further north, though, than what it's currently in the risk area for right now. But again, we'll keep you updated with the latest details. We might go live for this tomorrow, so make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe if you're not already.